This video is brought to you by Roll for Combat, an official Paizo actual play podcast. Join Acheron, Hap, Alhara, Riley, Darius, and the entire Circus of Wayward Wonders as they save the Starstone Isles from the dreaded extinction curse. Listen now to 3-Ring Adventure at rollforcombat.com. Hello, and welcome to Aquatic Combat in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. First off, let's talk about movement in water. The effect water has on a creature's movement will largely be determined by the GM, but the deeper the water is, the more difficult it will be to move through. If the water is deep enough that you can't move through it as easily as you can walk on dry land, then you face some kind of penalty. There are no hard rules for this, but the guideline I use in my games is if the water reaches mid-calf, then it probably slows you down and counts as difficult terrain. If the water is knee level, then it counts as greater difficult terrain. And if the water level is higher than your waist, then you probably need to make swim actions to move through it. As long as the water is calm, then you usually do not need to roll an athletics check to swim, but the GM may rule otherwise. Succeeding a swim check means you move through 5 feet of water plus another 5 feet per 20 feet of your land speed. And on a critical success, you move that plus another 5 feet. So for most PCs who have speed scores between 25 and 35, then they swim 10 feet on a success or 15 feet on a critical success. On a failure, nothing happens. You don't get to move anywhere, but you also don't start drowning. And it's the same on a critical failure, except if you're already holding your breath, then you lose 1 point of your remaining air supply. We'll talk more about holding your breath, your air supply, and drowning in just a minute. Also note that each type of movement requires its own action. So if you start your turn 5 feet from the water and have a speed score of 25 feet, then you have to spend one action to walk 5 feet to the water and then another action to begin swimming. You can't use your unused movement from the first action to begin swimming and combine walking and swimming in the same action. Each movement type requires its own action. And also be aware that any creature with a swim speed can completely ignore having to roll athletics checks to use the swim action, and they can freely move through water at their swim speed. And if you're curious how weight and armor factor into all of this, well, the game doesn't really go too deep into the specific penalties for weight, being in armor, or carrying a heavy load. The rules in water are the same as on land. If you're encumbered, then your speed score is lowered by 10, which may impact how far you can move with a swim action. Likewise, the penalties imposed by wearing armor, like check penalties and speed penalties, are the same underwater as they are normally. There are no extra rules applied for armor, for bulk, or for encumbrance when you're in the water. The aquatic combat rules apply whenever a player or other creature is in water deep enough to require a swim action to move. While within an aquatic environment, you gain the following. You are flat-footed unless you have a swim speed. You have resistance 5 to all acid and fire damage. When making melee attacks, you suffer no penalty if the attack does not pass through water. Say for example, if you're standing in waist-deep water, the GM may rule that aquatic combat applies, thus causing you to be flat-footed and needing to use swim actions to move, but you would not suffer any penalty to your attacks since the weapons are not being forced to pass through water. But if your melee attacks do have to pass through water to strike their targets, then you suffer a -2 circumstance penalty if the attack deals slashing or bludgeoning damage. When making ranged attacks while you're underwater or against targets that are underwater, if the ranged attack deals bludgeoning or slashing damage, then that attack automatically misses. If the ranged attack deals piercing damage, then its range increment is cut in half. So if you're firing a short bow, then its range increment is reduced from 60 feet to 30 feet, meaning there is no penalty for attacking a target within 30 feet, but there is a cumulative -2 penalty applied for every 30 feet beyond that. And the rules are meant to be simple here, so it doesn't matter if you're standing on shore 29 feet away from an enemy that's only 1 foot below water. If you or the target is underwater, then the reduction to range applies. And there may be some other considerations when attacking a target that's underwater too. For example, if the water isn't crystal clear, then the GM might grant that target the concealed condition, forcing you to make a DC 5 flat check to target them. Also, while underwater, you cannot use any action or ability that has the fire trait, nor can you cast any spell with the fire trait. And the GM may also determine that any other action doesn't work while floating or underwater. And really, that's all there is to it. Or at least that's all of the hard guidance the rulebook provides. I think they largely want to leave it up to the GM to decide how to best handle a lot of the specifics of underwater combat. That said, there are a couple of questions that always do seem to come up. The first is about fireballs. If you're underwater, then you can't cast a fireball spell. But if you're out of the water, then you can attack enemies beneath the surface of the water with a fireball spell. This works the same as casting fireball against enemies on land, except that when in water, the targets have resistance 5 against fire damage. And another common question is, what about casting a bolt of lightning? There are no changes made to electricity spells when water is present. These spells can be cast underwater provided you're able to provide the required spell components as usual and suffer no penalties or bonuses. Now, the GM might allow for other effects as flavor or as the rule of cool, but there is nothing in the rules that treats electricity damage any different in water than on land. And one more question that often comes up is what happens when a character is knocked out while they're in the water. In this case, the GM decides whether they float to the surface or sink to the bottom. Most PCs carry enough gear to cause them to sink to the bottom. Which leads us to the next topic, drowning and suffocation rules. Creatures have an air supply of 5 plus their constitution modifier. At the end of every turn that you're unable to breathe, your air supply is lowered by 1 if you did not attack or cast spells during the turn, and it's lowered by 2 if you did attack or cast spells. You also lose an additional 1 point of air supply every time you're critically hit by an attack, or if you critically fail a save versus a spell. When you run out of air, you fall unconscious and begin suffocating. While suffocating, you must attempt a DC 20 Fortitude save at the end of each of your turns. On a failure, you suffer 1d10 damage, and on a critical failure, you die. Not gain the dying condition, but you skip past that whole mechanic and you die. On every round after the first, the DC of this check increases by 5, and the damage applied for failing the save is increased by an additional 1d10. So if you have a plus 7 Fortitude bonus, then on your first turn after falling unconscious in the water, you roll 1d20 plus 7. If the result of that check is 20 or higher, then you suffer no damage. If that check's total is below 20, then you suffer 1d10 damage. And note that when suffocating, suffering damage does not remove the unconscious condition like it normally does. And if you critically fail that check by rolling a natural 1, or you have a total that's 10 or lower, then again you die. Regardless of whether you succeed or fail that Fortitude save, as long as you're still alive, then on your next turn you roll the Fortitude save again, but the DC is now 25, and on a failure you suffer 2d10 damage. And every round after that, the DC increases by 5 more, and the damage increases by another 1d10. Once you have access to air again, you stop suffocating and lose the unconscious condition if you're above 0 hit points. Before we close, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of my patrons. These videos would not be possible without their continued generosity and support. Members of the How It's Played Patreon community receive special benefits like exclusive content and getting to vote on the topics I cover. If you would like to support this channel and help it grow, the easiest way to do that is by subscribing and clicking the bell icon so you get notified when new videos release. And I can always be reached through Twitter and Facebook too. Thanks for watching, take care, and happy gaming.